Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com. On this episode, we look back at the amazing story of the wheat variety Jagger. The K-State wheat variety Jagger was released in 1994, and it went on to become one of the most widely planted varieties in the United States. Even 9 years after its release in 2003, Jagger was planted on a staggering 45% of Kansas wheat acres. Jagger was planted in 2 foundation fields its first year. 9 years later, it reached its peak and had nearly 35,000 acres of certified seed production, with 1.3 million bushels of certified seed produced that year. During the span of 22 years, over 10 million bushels of Jagger certified seed was sold in Kansas alone. In its lifespan, Jagger was planted in 12 countries. Our guest today is Dr. Rollin Sears. Raleigh, as we call him, is a retired wheat breeder who worked for Kansas State University and later AgriPro Syngenta, and Raleigh is the man who made that initial cross that led to the variety Jagger. Raleigh, thanks for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
It is an amazing story about Jagger. We hadn't seen anything like that prior to that, and after that, I don't know if we'll see anything like that again. But give us a sense of the environment back there in the mid-'90s. What were some of the popular wheat varieties that Kansans were planting?
Oh, well, the 2 big varieties back then were Carl and Carl 92, which we released in 1987, and those 2 varieties were quite popular, but they were popular just in the central and the eastern part of the state. They didn't do well, particularly in the western part of the state. And the variety back then that was dominant in the western part of the state was TAM 107. And it had good tolerance to wheat streak mosaic virus and was planted on a lot of acres in western Kansas, western Oklahoma, and eastern Colorado.
At that time, there wasn't the competition we have now with some of these private seed companies. The public breeding programs, Kansas State University, Oklahoma State, were the main players at that point in time. So it wasn't unheard of to have a public variety on a number of acres. But to see Jagger become what it was, did you ever anticipate that happening with a wheat variety?
Well, probably not. I can still remember exactly when I made the initial selection for Jagger. I could probably walk out to the field and identify the row where it was grown today, because it was one of those kind of weird moments, I guess. But every plant breeder has a mind's eye vision of what the ideal wheat plant would look like, and you strive, in making hundreds of crosses, you strive to identify that plant type. And Jagger was one of those ones that just basically stopped you. I've always told people that it wouldn't have made any difference who the wheat breeder was. With that particular cross, it was like it just stopped you. I mean, you just looked at it and you thought, okay, this is it. This is exactly what I wanted to find.
Almost as if a spotlight shined down on that head of wheat. So
yep.
It takes an eye for that, I assume. So how long at that point in time had you been a wheat breeder?
Well, that was we made the cross in 1984, and the F2 plant that was pulled was probably made in 1986. And that was right during the transition when I was really frustrated at that time, because coming to K-State in 1980, Bill Willis was the plant pathologist at that time. And we were trying to, I was basically taught that as a plant breeder, you identified the particular leaf disease and then you gave it a score. And so we had rust, we had septoria and all kinds of leaf spots. We had smut diseases, but the leaf spotting diseases were really giving me a hard time. I couldn't tell the difference between various septorias and tan spot, and so I started gradually moving towards what I considered to be green leaf duration. So anything that had green leaves and made it through flowering and preliminary grain filling with green leaves were the types that I was looking for. And so when that population showed up, and we saw so many green leaves, so many really nice looking plants, we started pulling those plants, and then out of those selections, Jagger evolved.
Do you remember the environment that year that you recognized Jagger out in the field? What the conditions were like? What the weather was like?
Well, not really. Ashland Bottoms, where the K-State Research Breeding Program is based, during that time, we had quite a lot of septoria. Now we don't see a lot of septoria much anymore, but back in the 80s, there was a lot of septoria, and there was no stripe rust. There was a lot of heavy leaf rust, but no stripe rust. And but typically, we were having a lot more snow and colder winters back then.
Right.
And then warmer. I've always remember warmer summers. I remember the first summer we moved to Kansas in 1980. It was just one of the hottest summers on record. But we were really focused on green leaf duration, plants that were about 30 inches tall, and early. And we'd made it kind of a commitment that we were going to shift the maturity of the wheat varieties from the Scout type, which were predominant in the 60s and the 70s, the Scout type, and we were really made a commitment to try to make the wheat varieties about 7 to 10 days earlier in terms of maturity to try to escape the high temperatures, which seems like it almost always in Kansas, regardless of how good the wheat crop looks, it seems like we always get a hot, dry wind right around the last of May, the first week of June, which kind of ripens our crop. And we were trying to get something that was earlier that would escape the high temperatures.
I believe it was you who told me when I started working at Kansas Wheat, it's really the heat that is the number one factor in the wheat crop in Kansas.
Yeah, that's usually what those hot, dry winds. Usually, it's what ripens the crop and cuts our yield potential.
Yeah. Well, so genetics, whether you're talking about wheat or beef cattle, has a good pedigree. So let's talk about the pedigree of Jagger. What kind of led up to it?
Well, at that time, we had just, and actually the Wheat Commission was supporting this effort. We had just received funding to expand our hard white wheat program. And we hired a research associate, John Moffitt, who got his master's degree at Oklahoma State and was working with Dave Worrell at Vernon for Texas A&M. And John came up to work on his PhD with us, and so actually John made the initial cross, and there's always been a little bit of uncertainty about if we got the parents right on the cross.
Really?
Yeah. And actually most breeders will deny it, but there's a lot of by guess and by golly and pedigrees with the wheat breeding programs around the country. But the cross was made in 1984, and it was original. And the original cross, it's still listed this way, is with a Carl Sib, which was a sister line of that population that we never released, but it was a good parent in our breeding program for high protein. Mm-hmm. And then Stevens, which was at that time an exceedingly popular variety in Oregon. And generally, it's kind of an interesting story. I told John not to make that cross. So luckily he went ahead and made it anyway. Historically, crossing Pacific Northwest varieties with Central Plains hard red winter wheats has not been very successful. We've made a lot of crosses and not gotten very much luck with those crosses. And in this particular case, though, we just lucked out. The cross worked. There was we identified the progeny that we thought were going to be successful, and it worked out all right.
Before we go too much farther, you released the seed, obviously, in 1994. Why the name Jagger? Who was Jagger?
Okay, everybody always thought it was Mick Jagger, but actually, Joe Jagger was a farmer in around Minneapolis, just north of Minneapolis. He served with Kansas Wheat. I'm not sure if he was on the Kansas Wheat Commission, but I definitely know he was with Kansas Wheat. He was a huge supporter of the wheat program, and he was. I can always remember he was such an optimistic guy. I mean, always was complimentary, never critical, and extremely supportive of the wheat breeding program. And his family had a research demonstration plot. His grandfather and his father started it. So when we released Jagger, the release plot had been grown for 75 consecutive years on the Jagger farm.
That's amazing.
It was amazing. And Joe, right before we released the variety, Joe. They identified a brain tumor, and he passed away quite quickly. And I remember thinking about the name as the program got closer and closer to making a release, and I asked several of my colleagues, what do you think about naming a variety after a really influential supporter of K-State research, and so when I said I'd like to name the variety Jagger, and I remember Lowell Burchett, who at that time was the executive director of the Crop Improvement Association, and Lowell got teary-eyed and basically said, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So
we went ahead and did that.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, though, we had to check with Margaret Jagger and make sure it was okay. We didn't want to do that without checking with the family.
Nope, got to get permission first. So Jagger is released. It goes through its process of certified seed and is being sold by seed dealers, becoming clearly more popular among farmers. And also, that's in history, some of the biggest wheat crops we had were back there in the mid to late 90s. When did you first realize that Jagger was going to be outside of the box, that it was going to be much bigger than Kansas?
Well, when we made that selection back in 86 or 87, we started making reselections. And so actually, out of the initial plant that we actually pulled, we ended up making well over 100 reselections out of the seed that was produced by that plant, and we started narrowing it down, and which is a process all plant breeders go through. As we expanded and moved the variety across different locations across Kansas, we started getting a feel for its broad adaptation, and prior to that, I was always frustrated because I wanted our varieties to be a little bit more widely adapted, especially out into western Kansas, and Jagger actually proved to be one of those types of selections that did well really across the state. And then as we started to expand our testing with cooperating testing programs in Nebraska, Colorado, Texas, and Oklahoma, we realized that it was not only adapted well in Kansas, but really adapted into a broad area of the central and southern Great Plains.
Yeah, I'm reading. I have one of the original seed release brochures for Jagger wheat, and it says one of the original concerns was Jagger's winter hardness. It was recommended for areas south of Interstate 70, but it went well beyond that ultimately, didn't it?
Yeah. It actually turned out to be, winter hardiness is probably one of the more difficult traits to breed for. And historically, there's a winter hardiness line right along Highway 36. And year after year, you can tell a difference between varieties that survive south of 36, but when they get up north of 36 into Nebraska, they start having problems with damage. And so we were kind of concerned about that because one is Jagger tends to break dormancy quicker and grow quite quickly, and towards the end of February or middle of March as it warms up. So that was a concern, and then we really didn't have good data on its winter hardiness. And so originally we kind of decided, okay, well, let's be conservative. And probably that's the one of the more important things the agronomy team, the wheat team in Kansas has to decide upon is where that variety is recommended, because the worst mistake you can make is recommending a variety where it's really not adapted, and then having a farmer plant that on 1,000 acres, for example, and having it significantly damaged. You just don't want to go there.
All right. So do you recall how many states ultimately was planted in the central United States?
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, it was grown on 12 countries around the world. It was actually planted as a winter wheat in most of those countries, but it was actually planted as a spring wheat in Argentina.
Really?
It's kind of interesting. It has very little vernalization or cold requirement, but it combines that with actually pretty good winter hardiness. So it's been grown widely in South Dakota, but it was also grown a little bit in Wyoming, a little bit in North Dakota, and a little bit in Montana as well. Farmers, when they hear about these varieties, farmers tend to be kind of risky, and so they'll kind of plant small acreages to see how they do. And when Jagger got up into North Dakota and Montana, it was a little bit too cold.
Yeah. So that cross with the Pacific Northwest variety, which you said was a white variety, is that correct?
Yeah, it was soft white variety.
So what did that bring to the table? What do you think that contributed?
Well, the biggest thing it contributed, there's a little segment that was introduced into wheat because of its resistance to strawbreaker root rot, and this segment, it came from a wild relative, Aegilops ventricosa, and wheat. Getting into genetics here a little bit, but wheat basically, because it's a parent of three distinct diploid grasses, has a very flexible and wide genome, and so it's really not easy, but it's not as hard to introduce various chromosome segments into wheat that have pretty beneficial of effects. And so there's a history of translocations or alien wheat segments that have been introduced into wheat going back, even before World War II, that have ended up being really, really beneficial to the overall wheat crop. And it turned out that ventricosa, for whatever reason, that particular segment, along with having strawbreaker root rot resistance, that particular segment really adds adaptation and drought tolerance to whatever plants are grown. And so I think today it's a very high level. It's like 85 or 90% of the wheat varieties that are grown in the central and central plains in the U.S. have that segment now.
So it was important. Did you have the benefit of molecular markers back then?
No. Didn't have that.
This was all just phenotyping, right? You knew what traits there were and moved them in.
Well, yeah, we didn't know for sure what traits we were, but you had a mind's eye mind's eye vision of what it should look like, and usually you could be pretty correct on those things.
Yeah. So when you were crossing a white with a red, did that lead to any problems color-wise?
Well, not really. I mean, the segregation sorted itself out, and actually we ended up a little bit later releasing a hard white wheat called Betty, mm-hmm. which was from that same population that Jagger evolved from. So we got a white wheat as well as a red wheat. And Betty probably, at least from my opinion, represented the high mark in terms of high protein and excellent wheat quality that we accomplished in the hard white program at that time.
Yeah. Not only did Jagger have wide adaptability, it had a long lifespan. I mean, normally we say a variety will have durability and be around for maybe, 5 to 10 years on the high side, and Jagger went beyond that. What do you think contributed to that?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, generally, I've always thought that when a wheat variety got above about 15% of the acres, especially in south central Kansas, you could start to expect that there would be a mutation or an evolution in the rust varieties, either the rust races, whether it's either stripe rust or leaf rust. And usually those are the Achilles heels for the wheat plant. Sometimes it's wheat streak mosaic, but generally those three, either wheat streak mosaic or the rust, stripe rust or leaf rust. Jagger basically, I think, had a gene, it's LR37, that particular gene, for some reason just was a little bit more durable and lasted a little bit longer. But stripe rust was the disease that actually cut Jagger short. I think Jagger probably would have continued to have been a competitive variety for a number of reasons. I mean, the farmers in Oklahoma and Texas loved it because it was a great grazing wheat and it was early and it yielded well for them. Mm-hmm. And the guys in Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska liked it just because of its yield performance and disease resistance.
Did that early maturity ever catch up with it? Did we have some late spring freezes that you recall that harmed it any?
It's kind of interesting. I probably have more gray hair. I always worried about a frost during the time it was grown in late February to mid-March. Mm-hmm. But in 1999, we had a freeze event where we had warm weather and then a freeze, warm weather and a freeze, warm weather and a freeze. And that third freeze, basically, it looked like it killed a huge acreage of Jagger just as it was starting to get popular. And so there was a lot of grumbling, especially among the certified seed growers, that the crop wasn't as winter hardy as it should be. And it was kind of interesting because after that last freeze, we had what probably one of the more ideal growing conditions for wheat through June and into harvest. And luckily, Jagger was able to recover, even though it was a little bit later, was able to recover. And a lot of the fields, even though they didn't yield particularly well, yielded at least 40 to 45 bushels, when a lot of the varieties were yielding 50 to 60 bushels. But the farmers were so impressed, they came to me and they said, Jagger came back from the dead. and it did. It actually did come back from the dead.
Yeah. Do you think its tendency to tiller had anything to do with that, or just durable?
Yeah, I think probably just durable. Yeah.
Well, so Brett, you have good breeding stock there with Jagger. So obviously the line doesn't end there. When you've got something that good, you want to keep that going. So, how did you keep Jagger into your program, and what that meant for future varieties?
Well, the one thing that plant breeders, all plant breeders basically, but especially wheat breeders, struggle with in terms of maintaining a really competitive, productive wheat program is to identify a few good wheats in their breeding program that are what we call good general combiners. And basically a good general combiner is a wheat variety that when you cross it with different other strains of wheat, whether they're adapted to the Central Plains or whether they're introductions, you tend to get really good progeny. And Jagger just turned out to be a really, really good parent. And it's unusual, I think lucky for me, sometimes it's difficult to kind of comprehend what makes a good general combiner. But in Jagger's case, it just, as a parent, when we used it in our crossing programs, we just got really good progeny when we crossed it with a diverse group of materials. And so we were really fortunate at that time.
Yeah. Can you guesstimate how many varieties ultimately had Jagger in their pedigree, and maybe still do, I guess? Yeah,
I think that, I'm not sure about right now, but I know that about 5 or 6 years after Jagger was released, virtually a high percentage of the pedigrees in programs all across the Central Great Plains contain Jagger. And Jagger actually tended to be, and some of the majority of the 12 countries was basically in the Central Asia area, and what I tentatively call the stand countries. But all through that area, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, all through those, Tajikistan, all of those countries, Jagger was grown, and it was an extremely popular variety. It was introduced by the Turkish breeding program at that time. And actually, it's not a surprise, I guess, if you look at it historically, because Turkey, which was our first really successful winter wheat introduced in the late 1800s in Kansas, came from that same region.
Right.
So I've always looked at this as basically, well, we benefited from Turkey, and 100 years later we were able to share Jagger with them.
Goes back full circle.
Yeah.
So, and it was a great quality wheat too, and that's a huge emphasis of every program, but especially today, the way we mill and bake wheat. Jagger did make a really good loaf of bread. What do you think gave it those characteristics?
Well, the program is not. We don't have that same program now, but at that particular time, we were. Scout was grown as a popular variety, and then when I first came to Kansas, Newton was the big variety, and Newton almost was grown on as many acres as Jagger was. I think it got up to like 42% of the acres.
Wow.
And but Newton basically was a little bit lower protein. It always had strong mixing patterns, but lower protein. And the wheat program basically initiated an NIR program, and it was a cooperative program between Grain Science and the wheat breeding program within the agronomy department, where Dave Wetzel, who was running that program at that time, was using NIR, near infrared, and we were able to rapidly identify between the time we harvested and before we planted, we were able to rapidly identify a large number of lines and what their potential protein content was. And that was really important, because when you're selecting for yield and you don't know what the protein concentration is, you ultimately are going to select for higher yield and lower protein. It's
right.
Just a negative relationship. But if you can select for protein first and identify the high protein lines, and then select within those high protein lines the highest yielders, you can actually breed for both pretty successfully. And so K-State always had an active collaboration with the USDA Grain Marketing Lab. So we were, running all of that material through through baking evaluation and baking tests, and then the grain science department also had a mill and bake evaluation. So it was basically a program that was strongly supported by the grain science and USDA Grain Marketing Lab and the breeding program, and we were actively trying to improve quality, and we were able to do that. I think, and I don't know for sure, but I've always thought that it wasn't so much the cross. It was basically the testing that was able to identify, Jagger as a pretty good quality wheat. And actually, Jagger was really, it's high protein for its yield potential. It had good, strong mixing characteristics. It wasn't the greatest milling wheat. It was okay,
really,
but not the greatest milling wheat. Yeah.
In terms of extraction,
well, it had extraction was the biggest deal. It because of it had such a fertile head. Jagger tends to have an array of different kernel sizes, which frustrated the milling industry.
Yeah, I suppose so. Well, Raleigh, you are retired, but you're still working as a breeder of some sorts today. Tell us what you're doing with Trick-Haley.
Well, I still have a lot of energy, and I enjoy breeding very much. So after I retired, I started working on Tritic-Haley. I still think that Tritic-Haley, grain type Tritic-Haleys have a lot of potential. Especially as we start to have issues with water availability in the Ogallala Aquifer. And so I started working on hybrid Tritic-Haley, and so there's in a cooperation with a small breeding program, Northern Seeds, that was based out of Montana, but we've been able to develop about 4 different hybrids now that they are marketing. And then since that time, I've shifted over and started to work a little bit on hybrid wheat as well. But I'm trying to work in the fringe areas, in areas that don't get a lot of attention, and might work and might not work. Maybe, I guess, kind of high risk. But when you're 72 years old and retired and have a little bit of time to be curious, it's a good project to be involved in.
Well, curiosity keeps us young, so I imagine you've seen a lot of change, a little bit of change between 1980 and 2023 in terms of what tools breeders have available to them.
Yeah, certainly. I remember, at that time, we were just really starting to focus on molecular markers. In fact, Alan Fritz, who's the breeder at K-State now, when Alan was working on his PhD, he actually did one of the first studies with molecular markers.
Wow.
And so it was kind of exploratory back then. But the key to breeding even today is really about being out in the field and spending time with that wheat plant. And I've always felt like every time we make an advancement, is just adding a different and unique and valuable tool to the toolbox that breeders have. But successful breeders, in my whole career, the successful breeders are the ones that spend time in the field. And I'll always remember when I was a graduate student back in the early 70s, I was down in northern Mexico and walking around in fields with Dr. Norman Bolarg, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Green Revolution. And there was a group of us. We were all students, and we asked him how you become a successful breeder. He turned, and he had the brightest blue eyes. I can always remember his eyes were just brilliantly blue, and he looked at us and he said, you go to the field, 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 and then you go to the field some more. And he said, when the wheat plant starts to talk to you, then you know you made it. And we all basically went back to our rooms that night, and I don't think any of us completely understood what he was talking about. But over the years, you start becoming, as you go to the field and you go to the field, you recognize and you see things. And pretty soon, all of a sudden, you realize, you can talk to that wheat plant. It may not be verbal, but it is certainly visual. You can really talk to that wheat plant.
And when Jagger was talking, you were listening.
Yeah, luckily.
Well, Raleigh, I think that's a great way to wrap this up. Thank you so much for revisiting this topic with us. I think it's nice to remember this. It's good to look back in history and how we can learn going forward. And thank you for your contributions to the industry. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much.
And that concludes this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My thanks to Raleigh Sears for joining us. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at podcast@kswheat.com and visit us on the web at kswheat.com. I'm Aaron Harries. Thanks for listening.